Comincio con due esperienze molto personali mie, cominciando con la mia famiglia, dove ho vissuto in una famiglia cattolica dove mamma e anche mio padre, tutti e due, erano molto attivi nella parrocchia.
There are moments in life when time seems to pause. When something so simple, so human, becomes a doorway into the divine. Imagine this scene. A quiet afternoon in Rome. The sun filters through the curtains of the apostolic palace, casting long golden lines across the marble floor. And there he sits, Pope Leo XIV, the man who leads millions of Catholics across the world, the successor of Peter, the spiritual father of the Church. But this time, he isn't speaking about papal reforms or global issues. He isn't addressing theologians or politicians. He's talking about something far more intimate. He's talking about his mother. The journalists in the room grow silent. Even the clicking of cameras pauses as if the moment itself demands reverence. And then, with a voice trembling not from age but from emotion, he begins to speak. "My mother," he says, "taught me everything I know about love, about faith, about what it truly means to serve." Those words, spoken softly yet powerfully, move like a breeze through the hall, and somehow, through the screen, they reach us too. Before we continue this story, dear brothers and sisters, I want to invite you to pause and feel. Think of the word mother. What stirs in your heart when you hear it? Warmth? Pain? Gratitude? Maybe longing? Whatever it is, it's sacred. Because behind that word lies 1,000 quiet sacrifices, whispered prayers, sleepless nights, and unconditional love, the kind of love that shapes souls and builds saints. Now, before we continue deeper, please take a moment. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel, not just to support the work we do here, but to stay part of a family that shares stories of faith, miracles, and hope. And in the comments, tell me, where are you watching from, and what comes to your heart when you think of your mother? Because today, this story isn't just about the Pope. It's about you. It's about the women, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, wives, and spiritual mothers who quietly transform the Church every single day. It was October 2025. The Vatican was alive with anticipation for the extraordinary Jubilee, a sacred year of mercy and reflection. Pilgrims filled the squares. The bells of St. Peter's rang with solemn joy. Inside one of the Vatican's press rooms, the atmosphere was reverent yet curious. Pope Leo XIV, once known as Father Robert Francis Prevost, a humble missionary who had served the poor in the harsh regions of Peru, had agreed to meet with a small group of journalists. For weeks, whispers had filled the air. Would he speak about reform? About the growing voices of women in the Church? The question finally came. "Your Holiness," one journalist began softly, "what is your view on the role of women in the Church today, especially as so many are calling for greater recognition?" The room grew still. The Pope leaned back, his eyes reflecting a deep, inner light, not the light of intellect, but of memory. He smiled, gently. The kind of smile that holds entire lifetimes within it. Then he said something no one expected. "Oh, the women," he whispered. "They are the beating heart of the Church, aren't they?" And in that moment, he did not quote theology or canon law. He did not open a Bible or a document. Instead, he told a story, his story. He spoke of his mother, an Italian immigrant woman of deep humility and strong faith. She was not a theologian or a scholar. She did not hold a degree in philosophy. But what she held was far greater, a heart completely given to God. She was the kind of woman whose hands were never still, always busy caring, cooking, helping, praying. Every morning, little Roberto, the boy who would one day become Pope, would wake up not to the sound of alarms, but to the soft murmur of her prayers. He said? She didn't pray to impress anyone. She prayed like someone speaking to her closest friend. He would hear her whisper words like, "My God, thank you for this new day. Give my son hands to work and a heart to love. May he be kind like Joseph and faithful like Mary." Those words, spoken over him day after day, became the melody that guided his soul. He didn't realize it then, but those simple morning prayers were writing theology into his heart, a theology not of the head, but of the heart. His mother often said something he would never forget. "Roberto, God gave you hands to work and a heart to love. Use both, every day." That was her gospel. That was her doctrine. And it became the foundation of his priesthood and papacy. Maybe you've had someone like that in your life too, a woman who didn't just speak about God, but revealed him through how she lived. A grandmother who never stopped praying. A mother who forgave endlessly. A teacher who believed in you when no one else did. If someone like that comes to your mind right now, whisper a prayer for her. Because the world rarely celebrates these quiet souls, but heaven never forgets them. Pope Leo's mother wasn't wealthy, and she didn't live an easy life. She worked long hours to keep the family together. Their home was modest, simple walls, few decorations, but it was filled with peace. After finishing her chores, she would walk through the neighborhood, carrying food to those who had even less. No one had to tell her to serve, she simply did it because love demanded it. At the parish, she volunteered to teach catechism to the children who came barefoot, shy, or hungry. No one asked her. She just showed up every Sunday because she believed that every child deserved to know that God loved them. Pope Leo would later say, "My mother didn't just teach me to believe in God. She taught me to see God in everyone." That, dear friends, is the quiet power of women in the Church. They don't always stand at pulpits or wear vestments. But they build altars, in kitchens, in classrooms, in hospitals, in homes. They sanctify the ordinary. Years later, when Roberto grew up and became a priest, he carried her lessons like sacred relics in his soul. When he was sent to Peru, far from home, in a land of mountains, poverty, and storms, he often remembered his mother's voice. Her words echoed like prayer bells across the distance. Be like Mary, who said yes without hesitation. He would see families struggling to survive, children without shoes, and mothers who had lost everything yet still smiled when they prayed. He saw, in their eyes, the same faith his mother carried. And he began to realize, the strength of the Church has always rested on the shoulders of such women. It was during those missionary years that his faith was tested the most. He was young, exhausted, and often discouraged. Resources were few. The needs were endless. Sometimes he would kneel in the little chapel and whisper, "Lord, how can I go on?" And then, one day, a miracle arrived, not from heaven's clouds, but from the humble hands of his mother. She was old by then, living far away. But she sat down one afternoon, took a piece of thin paper, and began to write to her son, not on a screen, not through an email, but through the slow, sacred rhythm of a handwritten letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote. "Do not be afraid, Roberto. Mothers move mountains, just as the Virgin did at Cana." She reminded him that when the wine ran out and the celebration seemed doomed, it was Mary, a woman who noticed, who cared, and who quietly moved heaven to act. Those words reached him weeks later, dusty and creased from the long journey across oceans and continents. But when he read them, something happened. It was as if God himself spoke through that fragile paper. His spirit was renewed. That letter, he said later, was my miracle. Pause here for a moment. Think about that, a mother's words crossing miles and time, becoming the spark that reignited her son's mission. How many of you have received such a letter, or a text, or a prayer, or a hug that lifted you when you were falling? How many mothers, grandmothers, and women of faith have been the unseen miracle workers in your story? If you're thinking of one right now, type her name in the comments below. Let's honor them together. Because heaven honors them already. When the Pope finished telling that story, the room was silent. No one took notes. No one interrupted. They simply listened, because something holy was happening. He looked up and said quietly, "The church without women would be like a body without a soul." The words hung in the air like incense. And you could feel it, that this wasn't a prepared statement. It was revelation. He continued, "It is the women who give the church her tenderness, her endurance, her soul." And in that moment, journalists, photographers, and priests alike all saw something beyond doctrine. They saw love made visible. They saw the living truth of a son honoring his mother, a shepherd honoring his flock, and a pope honoring the sacred feminine strength that sustains the entire church. So many of us go through life underestimating our small acts, a kind word, a meal shared, a prayer whispered. But what if those are the very things holding the world together? What if that unseen mother, grandmother, or nun praying quietly at dawn is what keeps the church alive today? This story, Pope Leo's story, reminds us that holiness often hides in the smallest gestures. And it invites us to look again at the women around us, to see in them what God sees, the heart of his church. Behind every saint, every priest, every pope, there is a woman who prayed the way forward. Maybe that woman is your mother. Maybe it's your wife. Maybe it's you. And that is the beginning of Pope Leo XIV's touching story of his mother and the women who transform the church. When the letter finally reached him, it was already weathered, the edges soft, the ink slightly faded, as if it had carried not only words, but a journey of love across the world. It had traveled thousands of miles, from Italy to the dusty hills of Peru, through hands, post offices, and prayer. And when Father Roberto, not yet Pope Leo XIV, opened it, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Home. The scent of paper, the familiar handwriting, the words of his mother, it was as if her voice was whispering right beside him, breaking through the exhaustion that had begun to weigh on his soul. "Do not be afraid, Roberto," she wrote. "Mothers move mountains, just as the Virgin did at Cana. When the wine was gone and all seemed lost, it was Mary who noticed, Mary who believed, and Mary who asked. And through her faith, the first miracle came." He read the letter again and again, as though each word carried breath from heaven. It was not eloquent. It was not poetic. But it was alive. And in that small, unassuming message, the weary missionary priest found his courage again. Peru was not an easy mission field. The land was breathtaking, towering mountains, sunlit valleys, yet the people he served often lived with heartbreaking poverty. The roads were long and lonely, and there were days when he rode through storm and mud for hours, only to reach a village that had nothing to give except their faith. He saw hunger. He saw loss. He saw children die because medicine never came. And sometimes, he asked God questions that had no easy answers. "Why do you send me here?" he prayed one night, kneeling on the cold dirt floor of a small chapel, "when I have so little to offer?" He looked at the cracked crucifix on the wall, the one that hung slightly tilted, and he whispered through tears, "I am tired, Lord." It was during one of those nights that his mother's letter arrived. The villagers had found the mailman riding through the town and brought the letter to him with joy, saying, "Padre Roberto, something came for you." He didn't open it immediately. He sat for a long while holding it, knowing instinctively that whatever was inside carried the same strength that had once held him as a child. And when he finally unfolded it under candlelight, he wept. "Do not be afraid." Those words pierced through the fog of discouragement like sunlight through storm clouds. He realized then, God had not forgotten him. The next morning, he rose before dawn and went to the small mission chapel. He held the letter close to his heart and knelt before the tabernacle. He prayed not for success, not for comfort, but for endurance. That day, a chain of small miracles began to unfold, not the kind that make headlines, but the quiet kind that heaven writes in hidden ink. A stranger came offering help to rebuild a damaged roof. A doctor from a nearby town visited unexpectedly with medical supplies. A drought that had threatened the crops finally broke with gentle rain. Coincidence? Perhaps to the world. But to him, it was the echo of his mother's faith. He would later tell close friends. Her letter was a sacrament of grace, a reminder that God's miracles often begin with the courage of a woman who believes. Years later, after returning to Rome, he would often reflect on that season of his life. He said once in an interview, "I learned theology in books, but I learned the gospel in my mother's kitchen." He remembered her wiping flour from her hands to bless him before school. He remembered her kneeling to pray even when her body was weary. And he remembered her laughter, that light that filled their small home with joy even in difficult times. Faith, he said, wears an apron more often than a crown. How true that is! Because holiness doesn't always live in cathedrals. Sometimes it lives in kitchens, in hospitals, in classrooms, in those who serve with quiet love. There's something deeply divine about the simplicity of a woman's faith. It doesn't demand to be seen, it simply is. Like Mary's yes, it changes everything without making a sound. And this truth, is what Pope Leo XIV carried with him long before he ever wore the white robes of Peter. It shaped his heart, his ministry, and his vision of the Church. He never forgot the women he met in Peru, the mothers who prayed for food, the grandmothers who gathered children around rosaries, the nuns who worked quietly among the sick. When he became pope, he carried their faces in his heart like icons of holiness. Fast forward to that day in October 2025. The journalist's question about the role of women was still hanging in the air. The cameras were rolling. The world waited. But Pope Leo didn't rush to answer. He sat in silence for a moment, looking down as though he were seeing the past replay before his eyes, his mother's prayers, her letter, her faith. Then he said, "The Church without women would be like a body without a soul." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. It wasn't an abstract statement, it was born of experience, of witnessing, firsthand, how women had kept faith alive in the darkest corners of the world. He continued, "They are not the Church's helpers, they are her heart. They are the first to believe, the first to love, and often the last to give up hope." You could hear emotion breaking in his voice as he spoke. Even the journalists lowered their pens. He wasn't giving an interview anymore. He was preaching with his life. The Pope leaned forward, clasping his hands together, and said quietly, "Let me tell you something. Every vocation begins in a woman's heart. Every priest, every bishop, every pope comes from the womb of a mother who said yes to life." He looked around the room, his eyes wet with tears. And it doesn't end there. The Church lives because women keep saying yes to service, to prayer, to forgiveness, to love. Those who were there that day said it felt less like a press briefing and more like a revelation, a reminder of something ancient, something sacred. And perhaps it was. Because what he said next would echo around the world. "You are irreplaceable." He paused after the word, letting it breathe. Not important, not helpful, not supportive, but irreplaceable. Without you, the Church loses her breath. Irreplaceable. It's not a word we hear often, is it? In a world that treats people as replaceable, as temporary, as interchangeable, to hear that word from the Pope felt like a healing balm. It was a word that reached beyond the Vatican walls, into the hearts of women watching from homes, convents, and hospital rooms across the globe. Women who had prayed for years without being seen. Women who had sacrificed dreams to raise families. Women who had served quietly without applause. Suddenly, they heard the Holy Father say, "Without you, we would not have the Church we know. Without your love, we would not have hope." And that changed everything. Because it wasn't just a papal statement. It was a son speaking to his mother, a priest speaking to his parishioners, a shepherd speaking to his flock, from the deepest place of gratitude. Pope Leo XIV then turned his reflection toward the Virgin Mary, the one his mother had taught him to love so deeply. When the wine ran out at Cana, he said, "Mary did not command. She noticed. She didn't demand power. She interceded." That is the power of love. The crowd was silent. It was not Peter who began the first miracle, he said. It was a woman. A mother. A believer. That truth, he explained, is what continues to sustain the Church. Women notice when something is missing. They feel the needs of others long before anyone else does. And in prayer, they move the heart of God. Dear viewer, as you listen to this story, maybe something inside you is stirring, a memory of your own mother, grandmother, or spiritual guide. Maybe she wasn't famous. Maybe she didn't stand on stages. But she taught you to pray. She believed in you. She carried your name before God when you couldn't carry yourself. That's the same sacred love Pope Leo XIV was speaking about. And maybe, right now, you need to hear those same words his mother once wrote. Do not be afraid. You can move mountains. Because that's what faith does. It moves the immovable. It brings wine where there was only water. It makes life bloom again where hope was drying out. If these words speak to you, pause this video for a moment and breathe. Think of one woman who moved mountains for you. Then, when you're ready, go to the comments and write her name, even just her first name, as a way of honoring her soul before heaven. Because every time you honor such love, you help keep her light alive. As his reflection drew to a close, Pope Leo XIV's voice broke slightly. Thank you, he said. Thank you for all you do, seen and unseen. For the prayers whispered in the night, for the sacrifices no one will ever know, for the love that holds the world together. He smiled softly. May God bless you abundantly. And in that moment, something beautiful happened. The entire room stood in applause. Not polite applause. Not diplomatic. But grateful applause. Some had tears in their eyes. Others bowed their heads, because they knew they had just witnessed not a speech, but an act of worship. A man giving thanks for the very love that gave him life. And somewhere in heaven, one humble woman, his mother, must have smiled. So, my dear brothers and sisters, what does this story say to us? It says that in every age, in every nation, God raises women whose faith becomes the foundation of renewal. Not through power, but through love. Not through recognition, but through devotion. You may not stand in St. Peter's Basilica. You may not wear robes or titles. But every act of faith you live, every time you forgive, every time you believe, every time you love, you move mountains. You carry the same spirit that moved Mary at Cana, Ruth in Bethlehem, and a mother in Italy whose prayers raised a pope. And that is holy. As this chapter of our journey ends, take this truth with you. Faith begins at home. Hope begins in the heart of a woman who believes. And love, the purest love, is the force that still transforms the Church. Every story of faith has a pulse, a rhythm that runs through generations. Through the hands that cook, the voices that pray, the hearts that keep believing even when the world grows cold. Pope Leo XIV's story is not only about his mother, it is about that sacred rhythm. The quiet heartbeat of women who, across centuries, have kept the Church alive. When the Pope said, "You are irreplaceable," he wasn't creating a headline, he was naming a truth older than time. From the dawn of creation, God wrote woman into his plan as co-creator of life, bearer of compassion, keeper of memory. It is not good for man to be alone, he said. And from that moment, the story of humanity became a duet, masculine and feminine, reason and tenderness, mission and mercy. Theologians might use complex words for this mystery. But Pope Leo's mother had already lived it in silence. She had shown her son that strength does not shout, it serves. That holiness does not separate, it embraces. Every time she washed dishes, every time she prayed for him while he slept, she was teaching him the theology of the towel, the same one Christ revealed when he knelt to wash his disciples' feet. That is the heart of the feminine vocation, to make love visible in humble form. Throughout Scripture, God entrusted his greatest revelations to women who dared to believe. Think of Hannah, who cried out in the temple until her prayer birthed a prophet. Of Ruth, whose loyalty rebuilt a family and a future. Of Esther, who risked her crown for her people. Of Mary Magdalene, who stood at the empty tomb while others fled, becoming the first herald of the resurrection. And of Mary, the mother of Jesus, whose quiet yes changed eternity. Each of them moved mountains, not by force, but by faith. They carried within them what the world often overlooks, a courage that listens, a power that loves. Pope Leo XIV once said during a homily, "When we trace the history of salvation, we see that God's miracles often begin in the hands of a woman who says yes." That yes still echoes through every century. It is the same yes whispered by mothers lighting candles for their children, by nuns caring for the dying, by wives forgiving again, by daughters choosing kindness over bitterness. The Pope's reflection did not end with gratitude, it blossomed into theology. The Church herself, he said, is feminine. She is mother and bride. She receives, she nurtures, she gives life. When he said those words, it was as if he was describing his own mother. Patient, forgiving, endlessly welcoming. He explained that the Church's tenderness, mercy, and hospitality mirror the feminine heart of God. Wherever the Church consoles the suffering, forgives sinners, feeds the poor, or shelters the lost, it is that motherly soul at work. He paused and added, almost whispering, every time the Church says, "Come home," she speaks with a mother's voice. And perhaps that is why the Church endures. Because behind every altar, every act of charity, every Eucharistic miracle, there is the same gentle strength that first said, "Be it done unto me according to your word." Our world often confuses humility with weakness. But the humility Pope Leo XIV learned from his mother was anything but weak. It was steady, unbreakable, like a mountain rooted in love. When she told him, "Be like Mary," who said yes without hesitation, she wasn't telling him to be passive. She was teaching him to be brave enough to trust God. That is real strength, the courage to serve when no one sees, to forgive when it hurts, to keep faith when nothing makes sense. And that is why the Pope said women are the soul of the Church. Because they embody that hidden courage every single day. Dear listener, let me speak to your heart now. Some of you watching may feel unseen. You pray in silence for children who no longer go to church. You carry families on your shoulders, communities in your prayers. Maybe you wonder, does it matter? Yes. It matters more than you know. Your faith builds invisible bridges between heaven and earth. Your tears water seeds you may never see bloom. Your forgiveness keeps love alive in a world that forgets how to love. You are part of the same sacred lineage that shaped Pope Leo XIV. That shaped saints, martyrs, and missionaries throughout history. You, right now, listening, are part of the miracle. After his address, the Pope was asked what memory of his mother he cherished most. He smiled through tears and said, "The sound of her praying when she thought no one could hear." That sound, he said, was the first homily he ever heard. A homily without words, just faith breathing in rhythm with God. It followed him all his life. When he became bishop, cardinal, and later pope, he carried that same melody into every decision, every blessing, every mass. It became his mission to remind the world that the Church's strength is not measured in power or politics, but in prayer. And so, he began to speak more openly about women in the Church. Not as an issue, but as a gift. He called for deeper inclusion, not to make statements, but to restore balance, to let the Church breathe with both lungs again, masculine and feminine, order and mercy, truth and tenderness. He often said, "There are saints walking among us whose names will never be written in any canonization decree, women who simply love." He spoke of nurses who hold dying hands, teachers who whisper hope into frightened children, mothers who choose life despite fear, and elderly widows who pray rosaries for the world each morning. These, he said, are the living tabernacles of Christ's compassion. Their sanctity is quiet, but it shakes heaven. And he urged priests, bishops, and believers to recognize that holiness, to honor it, to learn from it. The Pope often returned to the story of Mary at Cana. He would close his eyes and say softly, "Mary saw what no one else saw." The guests were still laughing, the servants still working, but she noticed the lack, the absence, the need. And she carried it to Jesus with a confidence born of love. He reminded the faithful. This is the vocation of every Christian, but it shines most clearly in the heart of a woman, to see what is missing and bring it to Christ. And isn't that what his mother had done? She saw his exhaustion and sent him the letter that changed his mission. That's what mothers do. They see the invisible. They intercede before we even ask. They call down miracles we don't yet realize we need. Pope Leo XIV believed that the renewal of the Church would not come through strategy alone, but through holiness, through the rediscovery of the feminine soul of faith. He once told a gathering of young women in Rome, "You are not the future of the Church. You are her present. You are her now. And without you, there is no future." He encouraged them to study, to lead, to serve, but above all, to love. To keep that Marian spirit alive in every vocation. Because, he said, the Church needs hearts that know how to listen. Hearts that can cradle suffering and still believe in resurrection. In his final reflection on the subject, the Pope shared a profound image. He said, "The Church stands as Mary stood at the cross, faithful even when the world breaks apart. That is what it means to be both mother and disciple." He looked around the crowd that day, men and women, young and old, and said, "We cannot speak of the Church without speaking of the women who hold her together with prayer and tears." Then, with that gentle humor for which he was known, he smiled. If the apostles had been left alone after the crucifixion, they might have gone fishing and never come back. But the women waited. They believed. They kept watch. That is why the dawn of Easter belongs to them. The crowd laughed softly, but the truth of his words lingered like perfume. Sweet, humble, eternal. Now, dear listener, let us bring this journey home. This story is not just about a pope and his mother. It's about you. About the divine fingerprint in your everyday life. About how God uses ordinary love to build extraordinary grace. Perhaps you have doubted your worth. Perhaps you feel small, unseen, or weary. Hear this truth. You are irreplaceable. Your faith matters. Your love is rewriting stories you will never see completed. And heaven is watching, smiling, recording every small act in the book of life. The Pope's mother never knew she was shaping a future pontiff. She was simply being faithful. And that is all God ever asks of us, to be faithful in the little things. As his address ended, Pope Leo XIV lifted his hands in blessing and said, "May you walk in Mary's footsteps. Humble yet courageous, gentle yet strong in faith. May you know, deep in your soul, that your prayers are heard. Your sacrifices remembered. Your love transforming the world in ways you cannot imagine." He paused, smiled tenderly, and concluded, "Thank you for moving mountains with your humble faith." The applause that followed was not merely human gratitude. It was heaven's echo, a chorus of unseen saints joining in praise. As the hall emptied and the cameras turned off, the Pope remained seated for a moment, hands folded. Someone later said he whispered, "Thank you, Mama." Maybe he did. Maybe every prayer he ever prayed carried her voice within it. And maybe that's the true miracle. That love, once given, never dies. It simply changes form. A mother's prayer becomes a son's vocation. A woman's yes becomes the Church's mission. A life of service becomes a legacy of faith. As you finish listening, take a breath and look around your own life. Who taught you to believe? Who carried you in prayer? Whose quiet faith kept your world from collapsing? Write her name in your heart or in the comments below. Tell her story. Because when you share it, you keep the sacred fire alive. And if this message has touched you, please like this video, subscribe, and join our growing community of faith. Together, we are building a space where the unseen saints of today are honored. where stories of love become prayers, and where every woman and man can rediscover their divine worth. When you wake up tomorrow and look in the mirror, remember, you are looking at someone heaven chose for this very moment. Someone who carries light into dark places. Someone irreplaceable in God's plan. May that truth live in you always. And may Pope Leo XIV's story remind you that holiness often begins not in grand cathedrals, but in the quiet faith of a woman who whispers, "Lord, let it be done unto me."